Welcome to the Political Checkmate, and today I'm going to checkmate this TED Talk video called The 30 Secrets of Capitalism and New Way Forward by Nick Hanauer. So here we go.
I am a capitalist. And after a 30-year career in capitalism, spanning 36 companies, generating tens of billions of dollars in market value, I'm not just in the top 1%, I'm in the top 0.01% of all earners. Today, I have come to share the secrets of our success because rich capitalists like me have never been richer. So the question is, how do we do it? How do we manage to grab an ever-increasing share of the economic pie every year? Is it that rich people are smarter than we were 30 years ago? Is it that we're working harder than we once did? Are we taller, better looking? Sadly, no. It all comes down to just one thing.
The reason why CEO pay is rising is because this study found that the CEO firm value has massively increased, and according to economist Tyler Cohen, the role of the CEO has increased because before they need just skills to run the company, and now they need to do better public relations, and now businesses are becoming more globalized than ever before, and more major businesses are becoming tech companies.
Economics. Because here's the dirty secret. There was a time in which the economics profession worked in the public interest for everyone, but in the neoliberal era today, they work only for big corporations and billionaires. And that is creating a little bit of a problem. We could choose to enact economic policies that raise taxes on the rich, regulate powerful corporations, or raise wages for workers. We have done it before. But neoliberal economists would warn that all of these policies would be a terrible mistake because raising taxes always kills economic growth. And any form of government regulation is inefficient, and raising wages always kills jobs. Well, as a consequence of that thinking, over the last 30 years in the USA alone, the top 1% has grown $21 trillion richer, while the bottom 50% have grown $900 billion poor, a pattern of widening inequality that has largely repeated itself across the world. And yet, as middle-class families struggle to get by on wages that have not budged in about 40 years, neoliberal economists continue to warn that the only reasonable response to the painful dislocations of austerity and globalization is even more austerity and globalization.
Well, this literature review that was done by economist William McBride that looked at 26 studies on the relationship between taxes and growth. The studies that were looked at controlled for various factors such as government spending, business cycle conditions, and monetary policies. The study found that out of the 26 papers that were looked at, 23 studies found a negative effect, while the other 3 studies found no effect. While with regulations, this study from the National Bureau of Economic Research found that regulations cause a massive decline in free entry, resulting in regulatory capture, where regulations create monopolies because they stop people from entering the market. While for minimum wages, this literature review found that increasing the minimum wage resulted in destroyed jobs for the less skilled workers. On the claim about the bottom 50% losing $900 billion of wealth is simply wrong because the wealth of the bottom 50% increased from $1.4 trillion to $2.3 trillion, according to CBO. Also, you have to realize that the economy as a whole has gotten bigger, and if you factor in Social Security to the data, as did this Yale study did, you would find that the top wealth share of the economy as a whole barely budged during this 30-year time period. While with the wage stagnation claim, it is a long debunked argument. I would recommend you to read this article from Scott Lincecum, who pointed out the flaws of the wage stagnation, such as what inflation calculator is used and looking at groups instead of individuals, or not factoring worker benefits would change the results. Also, if we look at real median household income, we see massive growth in wages.
So, what is a society to do? Well, it's super clear to me what we need to do. We need a new economics. So, economics has been described as the dismal science, and for good reason, because as much as it is taught today, it isn't a science at all. in spite of all of the dazzling mathematics. In fact, a growing number of academics and practitioners have concluded that neoliberal economic theory is dangerously wrong, and that today's growing crises of rising inequality and growing political instability are the direct result of decades of bad economic theory. What we now know is that the economics that made me so rich isn't just wrong, it's backwards. Because it turns out it isn't capital that creates economic growth, it's people. And it isn't self-interest that promotes the public good, it's reciprocity. And it isn't competition that produces our prosperity, it's cooperation. What we can now see is that an economics that is neither just nor inclusive can never sustain the high levels of social cooperation necessary to enable a modern society to thrive. So, where did we go wrong? Well, it turns out that it's become painfully obvious that the fundamental assumptions that undergird neoliberal economic theory are just objectively false.
The reason why economics was called the dismal science originated from Scottish philosopher Thomas Carlyle in 1849, who called economics a dismal science because economists like John Stuart Mill tried to argue for the emancipation of slaves. What economics actually is a social science. While for the claim that capital does not create wealth, I would say that capital is a component of economic growth because you're going to need investments to get stuff done. On reciprocity, it is defined as the practice of exchanging things with others for mutual benefits, especially granted by one country or organization to another. I don't see how this contradicts self-interest at all. After all, if a shoemaker wants to make more money, he would either make more shoes or produce better shoes to satisfy customers who are willing to buy more of the shoes. While on cooperation, it is just as important as competition under capitalism, because competition helps seize which cooperation in a business is more efficient. I gotta say, who is saying there shouldn't be cooperation with freer markets? And also, you should actually cite evidence because you're making claims that this is wrong without any evidence giving me names.
And so today, first, I want to take you through some of those mistaken assumptions, and then after, describe where the science suggests prosperity actually comes from. So, neoliberal economic assumption number one is that the market is an efficient equilibrium system, which basically means that if one thing in the economy, like wages, goes up, another thing in the economy, like jobs, must go down. So, for example, in Seattle, where I live, when in 2014 we passed our nation's first $15 minimum wage, the neoliberals freaked out over their precious equilibrium. If you raise the price of labor, they warned, businesses will purchase less of it. Thousands of low-wage workers will lose their jobs, the restaurants will close, except they didn't. The unemployment rate fell dramatically. The restaurant business in Seattle boomed. Why? Because there is no equilibrium. Because raising wages doesn't kill jobs, it creates them. Because, for instance, when restaurant owners are suddenly required to pay restaurant workers enough so that now even they can afford to eat in restaurants, it doesn't shrink the restaurant business, it grows it, obviously. Thank you.
I already showed that the literature review found that the minimum wage destroys jobs. Also, we are not saying that having more pay causes a decrease in jobs, rather it is forcing a higher wage standard causes a reduction in jobs. Since some workers who are not productive enough to reach the arbitrary wage standards would most likely lose their jobs compared to workers who earn enough skills to be able to get the higher pay. So on the case of Seattle, this study found that the minimum wage caused an increase in business startups outside of Seattle and a decline in entry for Seattle. While on jobs, this study from the American Economic Association found that it caused a decline in the rate of hiring low-wage workers, and while on pay, if you factor in the hours decrease, the net pay is only a small net increase of $12 per week. I would recommend you to watch this podcast interview with one of the authors of the study, Jacob Vidgor, talked about the Seattle minimum wage increases. He points out that Seattle was already a fast-growing economy before the minimum wage, and that businesses simply changed their business structure that they need less low-wage workers.
The second assumption is that the price of something is always equal to its value, which basically means that if you earn $50,000 a year and I earn $50 million a year, that's because I produce 1,000 times as much value as you. Now, it will not surprise you to learn that this is a very comforting assumption if you're a CEO paying yourself $50 million a year, but paying your workers poverty wages. But please, take it from somebody who's run dozens of businesses. This is nonsense. People are not paid what they are worth. They are paid what they have the power to negotiate. And wages falling share of GDP is not because workers have become less productive, but because employers have become more powerful. And by pretending that the giant imbalance in power between capital and labor doesn't exist, neoliberal economic theory became essentially a protection racket for the rich. The third assumption, and by far the most pernicious, is a behavioral model that describes human beings as something called Homo economicus, which basically means that we are all perfectly selfish, perfectly rational, and relentlessly self-maximizing. But just ask yourselves, is it plausible that every single time for your entire life, when you did something nice for somebody else, all you were doing was maximizing your own utility? Is it plausible that when a soldier jumps on a grenade to defend fellow soldiers, they're just promoting their narrow self-interest? If you think that's nuts, contrary to any reasonable moral intuition, that's because it is, and according to the latest science, not true. But it is this behavioral model, which is at the cold, cruel heart of neoliberal economics, and it is as morally corrosive as it is scientifically wrong, because if we accept at face value that humans are fundamentally selfish, and then we look around the world at all of the unambiguous prosperity in it, then it follows logically. Then it must be true by definition that billions of individual acts of selfishness magically transubstantiate into prosperity and the common good. If we humans are merely selfish maximizers, then selfishness is the cause of our prosperity. Under this economic logic, greed is good. Widening inequality is efficient, and the only purpose of the corporation can be to enrich shareholders, because to do otherwise would be to slow economic growth and harm the economy overall. And it is this gospel of selfishness which forms the ideological cornerstone of neoliberal economics, a way of thinking which has produced economic policies which have enabled me and my rich buddies in the top 1% to grab virtually all of the benefits of growth over the last 40 years.
The reason why CEOs are generally paid so much more than workers is simply supply and demand. Since CEOs have a massive impact on a business, many businesses are trying to find a good CEO to run that business, and they offer a lot of money for it, kind of like with baseball teams, where a baseball team would pay superstars a lot of money because they're going to attract more money hiring the superstar player, and that's why superstar players are paid more than S&P 500 CEOs, because they're able to attract more revenue than the cost of hiring them. I gotta say, if we look at the data on income shares by economist David Splinter, income shares are still consistent with decades prior when you factor in taxes and wealth redistribution. Well, on the third point, I would say yes, that's people in general are always self-interested, even if you're doing something nice. For example, if you donate to a women's cancer research center, it begs the question, why didn't you donate to another charity, such as Feeding My Starving Children, or the Red Cross. It's because you feel more satisfied donating to that charity over other kinds. With the soldier analogy, it could be because you shared a goal and were trying to save them over enemies you would kill because of the self-interest to achieve the goal.
Society. The new economics suggests just 5 rules of thumb. First is that successful economies are not jungles, they're gardens, which is to say that markets, like gardens, must be tended. That the market is the greatest social technology ever invented for solving human problems, but unconstrained by social norms or democratic regulation, markets inevitably create more problems than they solve. Climate change, the great financial crisis of 2008 are 2 easy examples. The second rule is that inclusion creates economic growth. So the neoliberal idea that inclusion is this fancy luxury to be afforded if and when we have growth is both wrong and backwards. The economy is people. Including more people in more ways is what causes economic growth in market economies. The third principle is the purpose of the corporation is not merely to enrich shareholders. The greatest grift in contemporary economic life is the neoliberal idea that the only purpose of the corporation and the only responsibility of executives is to enrich themselves and shareholders. The new economics must and can insist that the purpose of the corporation is to improve the welfare of all stakeholders, customers, workers, community, and shareholders alike. Rule 4. Greed is not good. Being rapacious doesn't make you a capitalist. It makes you a sociopath. And in an economy as dependent upon cooperation at scale as ours, sociopathy is as bad for business as it is for society. And fifth and finally, unlike the laws of physics, the laws of economics are a choice. Now, neoliberal economic theory has sold itself to you as unchangeable natural law, when in fact, it's social norms and constructed narratives based on pseudoscience. If we truly want a more equitable, more prosperous, and more sustainable economy, if we want high-functioning democracies and civil society, we must have a new economics. And here's the good news. If we want a new economics, all we have to do is choose to have it. Thank you.
On the first point, free markets can self-regulate themselves, and on 2 examples you give, such as the 2008 recession, my response would be to check out this book, The Meltdown by Tom Woods, where he talks about the true causes of the recession, being government intervention in the economy doing things like the Austrian business cycle theory and causing moral hazards for businesses. While on pollution, I would recommend you to watch this lecture by economist Walter Block, who talks about how the free market would handle climate change through things like stronger enforcement of property rights. On the second point, who is saying that we shouldn't have inclusions? On number 3, you can still enrich shareholders at the same time help workers and customers. After all, having problems with customers by selling bad products will cause a decrease in sales, and having a bad relationship with workers would cause a staff shortages, all would harm the shareholders' profits. So it's not really contradictory to enrich the shareholders. On the fourth point, I don't really see how this debunks self-interest, because if you do something bad like lying or stealing, that would cause self-harm, because those actions would simply harm you in the long run and not help your self-interest. On the fifth point, citation needed, because economic laws are similar to mathematical laws, for following certain steps would achieve the expected results. I would recommend this lecture by Bob Murphy to explain what economic laws are. This is the end of the video. Thank you for watching, and please donate to my Patreon so I can make more videos and have your video requests checkmated. And thanks for watching, and have a nice day.